Dennis Ashley, and he is the head of our trauma and surgery departments at Navicent Health, and also the Milton D. Hatcher chair and professor from Mercer University. And he's going to teach our Sunday school lesson this morning. So thank you, Dr. Ashley.
Thank you, Susan. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm going to walk around a little bit. Is that all right? If I get low, just give me one of those. I'm going to take this. I'm doing a good job. I'll just do it. It really is an honor for me to be here today. We've been working on this for some time. Susan and I have trying to work out schedules. But anyway, it's great to be here. I see a lot of faces. I almost feel like I'm at work. I don't have any Navicent slides, so go with it. But anyway, this talk is it's a different talk, and really what it is, it's a sort of a house call to the cross. It's really centered around what a doctor would see if he or she were there walking along with Jesus, the Via Dolorosa, going through the flogging, going through the cross. What would we see as medical providers as we go through this? So I'll be pretty scientific, but then at some points I'll also give you some of my opinions about my faith and what I think as well. This is not a feel-good talk. Everybody's happy now. I've given this talk several times over the last few years. It's a hard talk for me to give. I've seen things that would make most of you nauseated and throw up. I've seen the human body mangled in ways that you cannot imagine. And even for me, going through this, it gets to me and it's difficult. I say that to get you in the right mindset. We're all happy now. I've met some of you. We were talking about having some fun before we got started. But it won't be that way at the end. And I'm not going to apologize for that because Jesus did this for us. And I think you'll have a different view of Jesus and what he did for us after you hear this talk. So why don't we get started with that? Susan's going to be my Van White here and change the slides. I'm going to come out here just a tad where I can see a little bit better. Can y'all see that okay? Are the lights okay? Can you come down just a little bit? It won't make the room too dark. Oh, that's great. Is that okay? Is that better? Okay. So the sources here are several New Testament Gospels, the Roman historians, non-Roman historians, Jewish Talmud, and then Josephus. Putting all this together, you get an idea. This is not just Sunday school, no pun intended, Sunday school class. I've tried to make this talk very scientific as well as and historical, as well as bring in the gospel. So if there's non-believers in the room, we're going to look at this from a wide aspect. Next slide. We don't really know exactly when Jesus was born. There's some controversy over that with calendars changing and so on. But somewhere around this, if he were died in 30 AD, the Last Supper at that time was on Thursday, April 6th, and the crucifixion was on Friday, April 7th. Next slide. And in Luke it tells us, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. I didn't really know what that meant when I read that as a child, and I always thought, well, blood is sort of this big drop that pools together. And so I thought the writer was being just descriptive. Oh, it was just sort of heavy. But it actually was really blood, and there's actually a disease process that's associated with that. Next slide. Or a description. It's called hematidrosis. Next slide. It's and Luke was a physician, so he understood these things, and so his writings are very historic. He's very descriptive in his writings. And he tells us his sweat became like blood. Next slide. These are several in a row, Susan will go. It's from great mental anguish. Next. It is a rare condition, but known physical entity. Next slide. It's small amount of blood loss. Next slide. Oops, go back. So this, I've never actually seen this, but it is described, and basically under this kind of anguish, you can get small droplets of blood that are bleeding in the capillaries of the sweat glands, and you can have blood actually coming out of these sweat glands. Not a lot amount of blood loss. That's important as we go through this. We're going to talk about volume of blood loss and what Jesus was like when he got to the cross. But this is not a lot of blood loss, but it does make the skin more sensitive, especially for the beatings and things he went to. He was already being primed for pain. Next slide. The first Jewish trial, next slide, was about 1 a.m. or at daybreak. Remember, Jesus was captured, if you will, in the Garden of Gethsemane late in the evening. Next slide. He was taken to Caiaphas and the political Sanhedrin. Next slide. Guilty of blasphemy. Next slide. Blindfolded. And they spat on Jesus, and they struck him in the face with fists. So we see that the start of trauma is happening here late at night. He's under great anguish. If you remember at that time, his disciples left him, so he's starting to feel emotional stress as well. And you know what it's like when you lose a loved one, or maybe you don't, but for those of you that have, you know you want your other loved ones around you. Well, in his time of need, everyone left him. So he's starting to have emotional stress. He's having discharge from his face and from his pores, from this stress with bleeding. And now he's starting to be beaten. Next slide. And this is recorded in Luke. Next slide. Keep going. Second Jewish trial, soon after daybreak. This was with the religious Sanhedrin. I won't get into all the, I'm not a lawyer. There's actually a gentleman that's given this talk that I've heard before that looks at that's an attorney that looks at just the legal side. It's very fascinating going into the details of the legal side and how illegal these trials were if you follow Jewish law. Next slide. He was found guilty of blasphemy. And then finally, he was taken for his, at daybreak, hit that again, Susan. Hit that again. Yeah, there you go. And so, in that time, the Jews could not crucify or kill anyone. They were under Roman rule. So they had to get permission from the Romans for the death penalty. And so that was the reason that they went to before Pontius Pilate. Next slide. Next slide. Keep going. And you can see there that Pilate found no charges against him, as you know. He sent him to Herod because he wanted to pass the buck. Herod didn't find any charges and he was sent back. And then Pilate handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. Next slide. So, now just to walk through this is really sort of what happened to, I don't think I have a pointer. No, we did. There. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll walk you through this. This is sort of the old city, and you can see here the upper room. Who knows exactly where it was? It's depicted here in the lower part. But Jesus, after the Last Supper, he left the upper room. He came out of the gate, went through the Kidron Valley, or down through the Kidron Valley, up to the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where he prayed. That's where he developed hematidrosis, and the blood was coming out because he was under such great anguish. And that's where he was captured. So then they bring him back in. You can see now he comes to Caiaphas' residence. They have one of the trials. Then he comes back over to the temple, up in the upper right-hand corner for the trial the next morning. Then he's shuttled off to Pilate, then Herod, then back to Pilate. And then you can see he comes outside the gate to Golgotha, where he was actually crucified. And he was flogged in there as well. Next slide. What's important about all that is, I'll get into that in a second about how far Jesus walked, but what about his health beforehand? Was Jesus a healthy individual? Well, you read in the gospel that he walked all over Galilee and various places, so we think that Jesus should have been healthy because he walked everywhere that he went and he covered great distances. So his health was probably very good. Next slide. From 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. he suffered great emotional distress. Next slide. He also had a sleepless night, most likely, because remember he was beaten and he was arrested, so I doubt that he got much sleep. He was abandoned by his disciples and beaten after the first Jewish trial. Next slide. And then that diagram that I showed you, if you add all that up, he walked more than 2.5 miles, or about 2.5 miles during that time period with all that going on. So you can see all this is leading up, as we build the case for what he went through physically, and when we get into what his physiology was on the cross, remember, all this is taking effect, and it started the night before. Next slide. Now, just to talk a minute about flogging. This is not what I grew up with when I would see plays at church or various places where somebody would take a little make-believe whip and they hit a few times. These were brutal, excruciating torture, if you will, for the victim. And what they would do, they would tie you to a post. It might be a short post, it might be a tall post. You were stripped of your clothes, and you can see that this pulls the muscles sort of taut. And then you have two Roman soldiers, and the Romans were experts at this. They had squads. That this was actually their job. Some of them were 5-man squads. Sometimes they would have a relief person because these guys would get so tired. Somebody would have to come in. There would also be a leader there that would watch and make sure that you were administering full pain. If you knew the person or you were going to take it easy on the person, you would be in a lot of trouble. So there was actually an overseer or a supervisor for these death squads, if you will, or torture squads, that would make sure that you did it correctly. And you can see here we have a Roman soldier here and one at the top, and they would stand and swing this way, and then they would rotate. The person over there would swing. That way they could rest, and also you could get maximum torture. Sometimes they would use one soldier, and he would change sides and go to that side so that they could get both sides of the body. Next slide. And this just shows you some of the instruments they used. These were not simple little whips. You see this leather also has these metal balls in it, so the balls would actually hit and crush the skin or contuse the skin, while the leather would actually lacerate or cut the skin. Maximum torture. Next slide. And you can see this had a lot of them together. Next slide. Just a close-up view of what that looks like. Next slide. And then some of them even had little sharp things. So there's various, and exactly which ones were used with Jesus, I don't know that anybody really knows. But based on history and the way Romans did things, that's where we get all this data. This is well described in the non-biblical or secular literature, if you will, about how Romans tortured people and how they killed people. So that's where a lot of this data comes from. So let me go to the next one here. So what I want to do now is for me to get into the rest of the talk, we start getting into physiology. I need you to really understand what the flogging was like. Jesus died very quickly on the cross. What I mean with that, he was there on the cross about 6 hours. People could be on the cross anywhere from 3 to 4 hours to 3 or 4 days before they died. So dying within 6 hours was not unusual, but a bit unusual. And it shows how terribly depleted he was of his physiology before he ever got to the cross. And so that's why I want to focus for a minute just on the flogging. This is where a lot of the pain took place and a lot of his demise took place before he ever actually got to the cross. And again, from what I told you, this is not what we were taught as kids about, these sort of just a few lashes with a whip. And these were very brutal. The Romans were very good at it. And I think what I'm going to do now is show you about a 10-minute clip from The Passion. Hollywood typically gets these things wrong. They sensationalize everything. Spaceships are flying out, people are jumping off buildings. But I think actually Hollywood got this one pretty close to being right from what I would picture it being. This is very difficult to watch, but I want you to pay attention to the trauma. I want you will see pieces of rib showing here. When the Romans did this, there would actually be pieces of lung showing, pieces of kidney showing. These were brutal beatings that really caused a lot of blood loss and caused it was set up to cause maximum pain. So keep that in mind as you watch this. So I think you can see from that is how traumatic that was, and we have people that have read and understand the writings back in that time in the Gospels. The words that they used describe that we don't know how bad the beating was, but it seemed to be from the words that they used that it was worse than usual. And I think you can see from the depictions of this. Again, this is Hollywood, but you get the idea of how brutal this was and how traumatic it was to his body. We have about 5 liters of blood in our body, and that's about if you have a 2-liter Coke bottle in your refrigerator, it's about 2.5 of those. So that's our blood volume. And you can see the blood that was out on the ground there, which all these wounds that you saw were bleeding. It doesn't take long to fill up one Coke bottle. So as we move through this, we'll talk about blood loss, and you can see Jesus lost a lot of blood just from that flogging. So that's called hypovolemic shock. What that means is that blood comes out of my body and goes and I bleed out somewhere. People in traumas that rupture their internal organs and bleed, they have the same kind of shock that Jesus had. So basically it just means that we lose blood and that our body is trying to compensate for it. And so the way it does that is the heart rate speeds up. So if I don't have enough blood to pump around, I just have to pump the blood that I have faster to get oxygen to my tissue. So that's why my heart rate speeds up. My blood pressure gets low. So if I have a plumbing system, all I am is I'm a plumbing system. So if I don't have enough water or blood in my plumbing system, then the blood pressure drops. Just like at your home when you don't have water pressure. You know, if you have a leak, the water leaks out in the front yard, you don't have pressure inside your house running faucets. So that means if I don't have a good blood pressure, my kidneys are not perfused. My kidneys don't get blood flow, so I can't make urine. So we watch our patients for urine output to know that they've got adequate blood volume. And then I get thirsty because all my patients say, can I have something to drink? Can I have something to drink? No matter how bad they're hurt, they want something to drink because they're trying to replete. They want to get more volume in. They want to get water in. They want to get something in to push that pressure up. So this is hypovolemic shock. And that, I think, is what Jesus had right there. He was developing that at that point because he had lost so much blood with the flogging. So then that leads to another term. It's called metabolic acidosis. My blood is flowing around now. My organs are making energy or using energy, and they have waste products. They have acids. So they want to get rid of those. I breathe some of them out every time I exhale. Some of them I urinate out in my kidneys. And so if they build up in my body, then that causes problems as well. And that's called acidosis. And this is just what that looks like. You see the heart in the middle, and then you see the red lines or the red pipes. Blood is coming through the arteries and going to all these organs. It can go to my brain at the top, my lungs, my liver, my muscles, and my kidneys. And remember, Jesus' muscles are ripped open. You saw that trauma. That blood is just coming out of the muscles, going out on the ground. So it's not going back to his heart to be pumped again. He's lost volume. He's in shock. So his heart rate is going to beat up. His heart rate was probably well over 100. Even after he got done, he's probably 120, 130, maybe even 140 or 150 heart rate after he got done with that flogging, and that was probably maintained for some time. But anyway, this is sort of what happens with shock. Now, this is a complicated slide I won't really spend a lot of time on, but this is how we break it down. There's class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 4 shock. And basically what it means is how much blood did you lose. Class 1's not so bad, class 4's really bad. And you can see the things I talked about, blood loss, pulse rate, blood pressure, urine output, all these things over here are how we decide what level of shock they're in. And I think Jesus probably was somewhere, when he got done with the flogging, remember, I think he lost a significant amount of blood there. He had probably about 5 liters of blood in his body. He probably lost 750 to 1,500 cc's, or almost 2 liters of blood just from that flogging. And remember, that was just the start. He had to go back for some more trial, then he was eventually led to the cross. All the time that he's doing that, these wounds are bleeding, so he's continuing to bleed. So by the time he got to the cross, he was probably in class 3 shock up there. He probably lost at least 2 liters of blood. So that means his pulse rate would have been greater than 120. His blood pressure would have been decreased. And if you remember, when they gave Jesus the thing, the part of the cross to carry, he fell. You know, he couldn't carry it. He fell and had to get another gentleman to come help him carry the cross. He was already so weak and hypovolemic, I think that's probably why he fell. And so Mark tells us, and they clothed him with purple and twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So, taking all those open wounds, you know, after a while, your body tries to coagulate or clot off so that you don't bleed anymore. Well, when they put those clothes on him or those capes and then rip them off again, that just starts all that bleeding process again. So he couldn't really clot real well because they continuously put things on and take them off. Next slide. So, now we're into the crucifixion. Go ahead. I just hit two of those. One more. Okay. And so, the Persians were probably the first to use this type of torture. Alexander the Great introduced it to Egypt and Carthage. The Romans learned it from them. It was a slow death with maximum pain, and Roman citizens were actually exempt from this because it was so bad, except for maybe soldiers that deserted or the most vilest of criminals. So the Romans realized that this was a bad thing, and they didn't want any part of it in their society. And they actually had to come up with a word. When you say, "Oh, I have excruciating pain," and this is where that word comes from. It comes from the cross. They had to come up with a word to describe how bad the pain was, and that's where the word excruciating comes from. Next slide. So, you see a lot of different crosses and things. The cross, the tall part here, called the stipes, is usually mounted in the ground and stays there. The other part, the patibulum, is the part that you put your arms on. And typically, there's different type crosses, but probably the kind of cross that Jesus was on was here. What they would do is they take the patibulum, and it weighed somewhere around 75 to 100, 125 pounds. So it's a very big piece of wood. They would tie it to your arms, and you would have to balance that. So just think now how hard it would be for me to manage, you know, and I'm not in any bad health. If I couldn't, for me to manage 75 pounds with my arms out like that would be difficult. Think about that beating that Jesus went through and him having to manage that and carry that. No wonder he fell. And you can imagine falling with 75 pounds with your arms, you can't brace yourself. So who knows what kind of pain that caused when you fell going through that. Next slide. And you hear about they nailed Jesus' hands to the cross. Back in If I put a nail, spike nail through your hand right here, you would fall off the cross. It would rip out. The tissue in your hand is not strong enough to hold you on that cross. But what they did is they nailed right through the bones in the wrist, which is the bones between the two arm bones and the hand bones. And back in that day, the wrist was considered part of the hand. So when they say they nailed Jesus' hands to the cross, that's what they're talking about. And if you do that, you can see here, these fibers, these ligaments that hold all those little bones together in the middle of the wrist, which is what allows you to do this. You can move your wrist so well. Right through there is where the bones went. Next slide. Right there is where the nails went. And you can see there's some pretty important structures that run through there. This yellow thing running right through the middle is called the median nerve. There's also another nerve, the ulnar nerve, over on the side. But the nail would have gone right through the wrist, maybe right through that nerve. If not right through it, certainly right by it. And that would cause, you know when you hit your elbow and you say, "I hit my funny bone," and you dance around the room? Well, that's your ulnar nerve that runs right here. Just think what it would be like to put a nail or a spike right through the median nerve that runs in the wrist. Next slide. And this just shows you what it looks like. Based on archaeological finds, they think the nails or the spikes were similar here, about 5 to 6 inches long, about 1 centimeter wide at the top. And you can see as the nail went through the wrist, and when the median nerve is damaged, you get sort of like a claw hand. You know, you get a hit, so his hands probably look like this, and that's from the nerve damage. Next slide. And as far as the feet, you can see that the feet will put one on top of each other, and the nail goes between the bones. Now, the Bible says that no bone shall be broken in his body. And I think from the way I described this, you can see how these spikes go in between the bones and don't have to break the bones to go through. So it's, again, another piece of the Bible that backs up anatomically what we know today. Next slide. So, why do you die on the cross? You don't bleed to death. There's not a lot of blood vessels that I described, right where those nails went through your wrist and through your hands. So why do you die? You actually suffocate. You can't breathe. You might think, that sounds strange. Your mouth's not covered. Why would you suffocate or asphyxiate? Well, you see here the chest, the top drawing. My chest wall, if I take a breath, my chest wall comes out and air flows in my lungs. And when I relax those muscles, the chest recoils and the diaphragm moves and the air comes back out, sort of in and out, to and fro motion. Next slide. And this is showing the muscles. You see here, muscles of inspiration on the right. These little muscles contract and pulls my rib cage up, so I take a breath. And then when they relax and my abdominal muscles move and everything moves, I let the air come out. So inspiration is active. In other words, I have to try to inspire. I have to take a breath. I have to work to do that. And then when I exhale, it's easy. I just let go. I don't do anything really, and the air comes out. Next slide. On the cross, it's just the opposite. Since I'm up like this and I'm nailed to the cross, and all the weight is pulling down, I am in a chronic mode of inhalation. Okay? You know, my rib cage is pulled up. So just everybody take a breath. That's how I am on the cross when I'm hanging there. I've got full breath. I can't exhale because of all my weight. So to exhale, I have to pull against those nails, and I have to push with my feet to push my leg and my body up, which hurts my feet as well because all my weight is on those nails. And when I get up like that, then I can exhale. So it just changes. Exhalation is actually a lot of work. And then the victim would let go, and they'd inhale. When they let go, just by force, they would inhale with the weight. And now to exhale again, I have to pull back up and blow out. So you're constantly doing this up and down on the cross to breathe. And finally, victims, after a time period, they just wear out, and they can't go up like that. They can't breathe, so they asphyxiate. And if you remember, when it was time for the soldiers to come out there, they wanted to hasten to death, they would break their legs. The other two victims that were hung with Jesus, they broke their legs. Why is that? Well, if you break their legs, they can't push up. You're not strong enough to just do it with your arms, or you can for a while, and they couldn't lift up, so they would suffocate faster because they couldn't push their weight up. And remember, Jesus was already dead, so they didn't break his legs, which again goes along with scriptures that tell us no bone of his body would be broken. Next slide. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Now the Roman soldiers, it was unusual, like we talked about, that Jesus would die. So it's not unusual, but again, you think about it, that he would die so quick on the cross. The Roman soldiers, if they let someone off the cross that was alive, they would have to be crucified or go through, be killed themselves. So they were not about to let anybody off the cross that was not dead. So they pierced his side when they saw that he was not breathing, just to make sure. Next slide. And this is what happened. So remember it said blood and water came out. And some people have said, well, if they stabbed him in the heart, why would water come out first? There must be a discrepancy in the Bible. But remember, back then, they wrote with prominence. In other words, the fluid that came out, the fluid that was most prominent was listed first. Blood, to the author, was more prominent than water. So that's why blood was listed first, although probably water came out first. And the reason water came out, you see, this is the chest cavity, the lung. There's this cavity that the lung is in here. You see depicted here. And then the heart. And so if a spear comes through here like this, it goes in the lung cavity, and there's, with trauma and various things that he went through, there can be fluid, pleural fluid on the lung. That fluid would come out and be clear or maybe a little yellow. And then if the spear went on in and hit the heart, then blood could come out, blood and water. Next slide. And you see here this depiction, this is No one knows where it was the right side or the left side. Most people seem to think it was the right side. But the spear goes in, goes through the lung cavity, lets water drain out, hits the right atrium or probably right ventricle of the heart, and then blood comes out. Next slide. So, what would Jesus have looked like if he had survived the crucifixion? There were some papers written and things back many years ago by some very academic people that thought, well, Jesus was just, he was unconscious. He fainted on the cross. They took him down too early. They put him in a cool grave, and he just woke up and he sort of ran away. These were very, very academic people. I won't tell you what university they were from, but these were one of the most stellar universities in our country. And sophisticated people that actually believe this stuff. And I think after going through it today, you would be able to refute that. I mean, I think, I think I've shown based on science as well as the Bible that that's just not an option. But let's take a look at a second and just see what he would look like. Next slide. He would not be able to walk because of, he had wounds to his feet, so he's not just going to run out of the grave after having 6-inch spike nails put through both feet. Next slide. His arms would be dislocated from hanging on the cross like he did. Next slide. He'd have massive open wounds on his back. You saw how those wounds look. If your ribs are showing and things, you're not going to run around too far. Next slide. Infection would set in. They had no antibiotics back then. And then, if that wasn't enough, he had a spear wound from a Roman soldier that knew how to kill people. That was their job. That went through his chest, not to his abdomen, but to his chest. People just didn't survive those kind of wounds back then, let alone all these other things that happened. So next slide. So I think this was summed up very well by Dr. Alexander Mathral. He said, a person in that kind of pathetic condition would never have inspired his disciples to go out and proclaim that he's the Lord of life who had triumphed over the grave. By some chance he did get out of the grave, would these 12 disciples rally around him and say, yeah, that's our leader, looking that way. I just don't think that's humanly possible. So, next slide. So, I think the conclusion that we can reach here is that Jesus died on the cross. I think he underwent a brutal torture before he ever got to the cross. He then died on the cross and he was put in the grave. Next slide. I think that he rose from the grave. I think the Bible is plain about that. There's 500 witnesses that saw him. It's recorded multiple times that he was recorded that he was seen. So I think we can dispel that. Next slide. Therefore, I think we shall live. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know it's not a feel-good talk, as I said, but what is amazing to me is that Jesus actually went through that for us. Remember, when he was being beaten like that, it's one thing if you're tied to a tree and you're being beaten and you don't have a choice. It's another thing when you can tap out anytime you want and just really wipe out the whole human race. When those soldiers were making fun of him, it was easy to just take him out. But he chose to stay there. I don't know how it's possible. I was going to say I don't know how it's humanly possible. Honestly, it's not humanly possible. So anyway, and then finally, the thing that rings really home about me is these 12 men. When they got the new replacement disciple for Judas, the 12 men, I think all 11, except for maybe one, died a terrible death. They went to the grave, they went through torture saying that they had seen Jesus, that he was the Son of God, that he rose from the dead. People may die for a cause or for something, but when it really gets down to it, nobody's going to go through torture and die and say that this is the Son of God when he was beaten like that and didn't come out of the grave. So I don't think it's very logical that those 12 men would have gone to the grave supporting Jesus and being the Son of God. So that's it. Thank you very much.